Hi, I'm Ann Rieselbach, the League's Program Director, and I'd like to welcome you to the last night of live presentations by the 2021 Emerging Voices. Though please watch in the coming weeks for new content, including interviews by the League's digital editor, Sara with all of this year's voices, as well as lecture videos or presentations you may have missed the first time around. All of these will be posted on the League's website, where you can learn more about this year's voices, as well as past emerging voices dating back to the first group selected in 1981, which included Stephen Hole, Taft architects Susanna Torre, Loretta Venturelli, and Todd Williams, among others. Emerging voices are selected through an invited juried portfolio competition that recognizes talented individuals and firms with a distinct design voice and a body of accomplished work that has the potential to influence the disciplines of architecture, landscape architecture, and urbanism. The League staff, and a short shout out here for the skills of the League's program manager, Katarina Flaxman, researches potential candidates throughout the year, which are then reviewed in a two-step process by a jury that is generally comprised of past emerging voices, critics, and academics. The members of the 2021 jury were Daniel Barber, Milton Curry, Mimi Huang, Rosanna Montiel, Ronald Rail, Lola Shepard, and Rosalind Shea. And a huge thanks to the series sponsors, in particular, the principal supporters, Elise Jaffe and Jeffrey Brown. Additional support for the Emerging Voices program is provided by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, and by the Next Generation Fund of the Architectural League, which is a fund supported by a group of past Emerging Voices and League Prize winners. Architectural League programs are also supported in part by public funds from the New York State Council on the Arts with the support of Governor Andrew Cuomo and the New York State Legislature, and by the League's members. So please consider joining the League to help support all of our programs. You can find more information about membership, as well as the League's broad range of programs, projects, and publications on the League's website, archleague.org. Competition juror Rosalind Shea, a partner of the collaborative design firm Sham Shea and the Marion Mahoney Fellow at MIT, and I might add, the newly announced recipient of a 2021 Arnold Bruner Grant for Architectural Research for her project Listening So We Might See, Architecture and Oral History in Taiwan, will introduce tonight's speakers and moderate a discussion following the presentations. Please join in the conversation by posting your questions and comments in the Q&A section, not the chat section, please, of the site. And following the presentation, CEU information will be posted during the conversation. So I'm happy to turn this over now to Rosalind.
Hi, and I'll invite Lori and Sara to come in, if you will. Thank you, Anne. Thanks for that nice introduction. Hi, I'm Rosalind Shea, architect and a member of this year's selection jury. And I just want to say that it was an honor to review the work. It was quite a difficult process with all the impressive nominees, but a very interesting and engaging one that we as a jury were very grateful to have around the work shared. And I want to thank the sponsors in the League for supporting emerging architects and for supporting this platform as one that amplifies the work of architects who are transforming the discipline. So it's my honor to introduce tonight's two practices, Sara Zodi of Studio Zodi and Lori Brown, both of whom are doing work that I think is important and resonates in this particular historical moment in many ways. And I appreciate their work for foregrounding the role that design can play within issues of equity, community, and marginalized histories. So first, we're going to hear from Sara Zodi. Sara is the founding principal of Studio Zodi, a landscape architecture, urban design, and public art practice based in Harlem in New York City. Sara also teaches landscape architecture at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. As a jury, we found especially compelling Studio Zodi's special approach to site, where site is more than location. It is also a living repository of memory and a resource that sustains and is sustained by a community. The studio's work demonstrates a sensitivity to the cultural meaning of place, especially for historically dispossessed peoples, particularly present in the project in Freedmanstown in Houston. Studio Zodi's process cultivates the environment and community in a mutual relationship. After Sara, we're going to hear from Lori Brown. Lori is an architect, educator, writer, designer, and curator. She is based in Syracuse, New York, where she teaches architecture at Syracuse University. And as a jury, we were impressed by the way Lori brings a wide range of skills and tactics together to connect social issues to design by conducting conversations, by writing and disseminating ideas, in her advocacy for the underrepresented, in her teaching, by empowering and partnering with students, and not least through design and the creation of actual spaces. The outcome of her efforts to apply feminist values in practice, the outcomes are cultural objects that reach an audience and architectures that impact real people. So I'm going to leave it there, but I wanted to give an audience a sense of what was coming. And I look forward to the discussion after the presentations. And a reminder to the audience, please post your comments and questions, but put them in the Q&A and not in the chat. So thanks to Sara and Lori for being here, and I'm going to hand it over to Sara.
Hi, thank you so much for joining. I just want to start by saying thank you to the Architectural League for recognizing emerging voices in this field. And we're so honored on behalf of Studio Zodi. I just want to say we're so honored to be recognized among an incredible list and among colleagues over the years that we admire. So my name is Sara Zodi. A little bit about myself. I grew up in Louisiana. And it was watching this storm event brew and barrel towards my home state in August of 2005 that really propelled me on this journey of trying to find a professional or a disciplinary framework that would allow me to, explore and project into the factors that would manifest a Hurricane Katrina. Everything from the ecological to the cultural and the aesthetic, to the social and the political and the infrastructural. And years later, that is landscape architecture. So I'm the founding principal of Studio Zodi, a landscape architecture firm based in New York City, in Harlem, on Lenox Avenue. We describe our design methodology as being powered by site interpretation, cultural narrative, and a dedication to the craft of construction. So every project that we enter into, we bring this sincere sense of inquiry and exploration, and we look for emerging themes and really try to use those ideas to influence the decisions that we make at the detail scale, because ultimately it is the built landscape that expresses these ideas and ultimately makes people feel like they belong, or places feel like they belong in their context. And so this methodology allows us to work across project types, across scales, and across geographies. So I'll just share 3 projects with you today. The first is Genesee Street in Houston, Texas. This is a neighborhood that was built by people escaping the cotton plantations along the Brazos River following emancipation. They'd been previously enslaved. And they found a spot on the Buffalo Bayou that hadn't been settled despite its proximity to downtown Houston. And that is because it had really thick clay soils, thick vegetation, prone to flooding. And so they cleared that land, so we're talking about this spot here, and made their own bricks, paved their own streets, built their own schools, homes, institutions, all things that the city of Houston would not support them in. The neighborhood quickly became the civic heart of Black Houston, home to shop owners and teachers and doctors. But over the years, the neighborhood fell victim to what a number of neighborhoods in the urban core do. Among them, a freeway bisecting the neighborhood, a series of urban renewal projects, wiping away the urban grid, and more recently, the intensified development pressures given its proximity to downtown Houston. And so I was working on this streetscape project at the time. This is 2013. And, the civil engineers essentially probably, wanted me to do what they thought landscape architects do, which is tell them where to put the trees. And you know, and they mentioned offhandedly, well, you know, you could put a plaque, or maybe, or what if you did African pavers, and to tell the story of this neighborhood. But I wanted to really push and challenge how we approached the streetscape design. Started to do some history on the architecture that the settlers built, and found that it is rooted in Yoruba traditions of West Africa. And this approach to architecture was brought to Haiti when they, you know, among enslaved people, and during the Haitian Revolution, a number of those people and their descendants fled to New Orleans, and from there, this type spread across the bayous of Southeast Texas. So, you know, there are a number of compelling dimensions to the shotgun architecture, but a few of them are particularly relevant in Freedmanstown. One is the fact that the short end of the home is, you know, facing the street, and allows a sort of maximization of the number of people and homes that face each block. And coupled with the fact that, you know, there's this ubiquity of porches and steps that are, you know, there's no setback from the street. And so there's a gallery of spaces between the private interiors of the homes and the public nature of the streets. It's this gallery of porches and windows and doors and steps that blur the distinction between public and private, where people's most cherished memories lie. So while some of these structures still remain, I went out and documented them, really looking at the patterns and the textures of this gallery of spaces. Even looking at the paving pattern that the original settlers laid along a straightaway, you see this orthogonal pattern, and then in the intersections that breaks to form a diamond. And the idea that the elders in the neighborhood talk about is that the settlers wanted to mark the intersections as a space of ritual, and that this was a tradition from West Africa. And so my approach to the streetscape was to concentrate the salvageable bricks at the intersections, and where the school needed a site, there's a school here, where the school needed a site wall, that instead of a wall, you know, that there would be this kind of series of concrete panels recalling the essential dimensions of this gallery. And here I am modeling the shadows cast by the cutout windows and doors. The materiality being concrete and the color being black was really meant to speak to the modesty of the original structures themselves. And so I proposed casting that concrete with the wood panels from the structures as they come down, so that the panels are an actual grain of the original structures. And instead of, you know, off-the-shelf site furnishings, this gallery then also incorporates the porches and steps as a public offering for seating. And even the plant palette is evocative of the vegetation of the bayou that the original settlers worked with. And so, you know, what this project really brought to my attention and to my process is, you know, this is the stuff of landscape architecture: vegetation, curb lines, lighting, site furnishings, sidewalks and streets. And this is the stuff of our lives, of our everyday lives. And so even, you know, with a site wall, or with the lighting, or with your plant palette, every street that we walk down, every landscape that we design and build has the elements required to tell a story. We don't have to wait to be commissioned a memorial. That every investment that's made in our cities is, you know, presents a number of media to tell stories. This is a project from 2018 that our office did for the Fairmount Park Conservancy in Philadelphia. 22-acre site adjacent to the Strawberry Mansion community. So, you know, being commissioned to do a landscape design for this site, we started talking to folks on the ground, and everyone talked about this site as everyone's front yard. We heard about first kisses and important coaches in people's lives and mentors in the after school program. And it's this really special place for people, and the physical conditions of the existing site don't speak to, you know, looking at this, you wouldn't necessarily imagine that it means so much to so many people in this neighborhood. And so we saw our project as bringing more into union the physical conditions of the site with the incredible significance this place has for people. Among the things we learned was that sports was central to this community, an important part of intergenerational activities and relationship building, and that memory, it was really rooted in memory. That we started sharing some archival images with folks, and they really opened up to sharing their stories with us about this place. And one of the neighborhood residents gave us this poem. It says, "Now I have seen monuments, great geometric heaps of stone, lifeless towers raised to keep alive the dead. But I ask, cannot a monument that breathes be built?" So this idea of a monument that breathes really became a sort of creative departure for us. Our first touch point with the community, we came with nothing drawn. We, you know, didn't have a community meeting with the slide deck. We didn't do that. This neighborhood has a lot of block parties, so we threw a block party, and just a celebration of the park and what it represents for people. And so, you know, we had T-shirt making, and got hired caterers from the neighborhood, and poets and rappers from the neighborhood came and performed about what they love about this place. And it actually became a site analysis tool for us. You know, we were able to see the site activated and see the way people actually use what they're drawn to and how they use it. And so, you know, in continuation of this idea of a celebration of the way it is, we had all these prompts around where people can talk about what they love. And we also had one activity where the 150 participants were broken up into 6 groups, and they made collages about what they love about this place, collective collages. And the 6 groups then sent representatives to the front and presented their collages. And so we, as the design team, were sat in the audience and listened to people present, and we got to hear how they articulate their priorities and what they're drawn to. And so we took those 6 collages and did this sort of interpretive analysis of them, you know, not at a one-to-one scale, you know, but really looking for broad strokes and emerging spatial themes. And so we were able to cull from that 3 design guidelines. One was activating 33rd Street, this residential edge, all the way to the north. Second is bringing people into the heart of the campus. And third is forming a clear circulation system around the fields. And so we were able to very clearly continue to go back to the public and share how their input in the form of the collages very directly shaped the approach to the landscape design. So we really expanded the southeast corner as the social heart of the park, and shaped the landscape to hold this flexible lawn that both serves sports but also passive recreation. You know, family reunions were a big part of what people talk about, so that we have a number of groves and picnic shelters around the park, and extended a garden walk to the north to really bring people into this heart. We created what we called a memory plan, which is to say all of the memories that people shared with us. We wanted to, in a place where gentrification and displacement are issues, we wanted to communicate to folks that our approach to this design was responsive to their memories, in the sense that, we're not just trying to preserve them, that investing in this landscape is a way to fortify them into the future. And so making that connection clear between the stories and what's on the plan was really an important part of the process. John Coltrane grew up on 33rd Street facing the park. On the left, you see this sketch that he did of the mathematics of jazz music, and we translated that into a paving pattern that stretches across the site and became an armature for wayfinding and for inscriptions about notable people from the neighborhood. So here's our family reunion picnic grove. We got Meek Mill in there, who's a rapper from the neighborhood. People got a kick out of. So here we are in the heart, this plaza, looking out into the sports lawn, where we have a water feature with the words of the poem about the breathing monument inscribed. So as you're looking out into this landscape, that you're able to reflect on the fact that this community, the spectacle of this community in this landform, is the breathing monument itself. So one more project. This is Graffiti Pier, also in Philadelphia. A project we just wrapped up concept design for the Delaware River Waterfront Corporation. This is a 6-acre site on the Delaware River. So this is Pier 18, Pier 20, and our site includes some of the uplands area as well. Like many of our projects, we start with really deep research and found that the history of coal here really has an interesting relationship to the history of graffiti. This site Pier 18 was a coal chute, and in the 1970s, when coal declined, it happens to coincide in time with the invention of graffiti, which actually happened in Philadelphia, not in New York. They will have you know. And so it was the sites like this, like this coal chute, fell into disuse upon that decline. And so that coincidence meant that Pier 18 emerged as a really important space for graffiti writers and street artists. And so since the 1970s, artists have been jumping the fence, and they have made this into an incredible outdoor street art museum. One other point in this timeline is that in 2010, when Instagram happened, the site moved past its life as an underground spot to attracting more and more people as people started to post and tag it. And so it became a liability issue for the railroad company that owns the site, and they started to explore with the Delaware River Waterfront Corporation the idea that this may become a publicly accessible space. And so we were commissioned in view of that. So this gives you a sense of what it looks like here at Pier 18. This is under the trestle. And so, I mean, every day you go out there, it looks completely different. It is still a very dynamic, very changing space. And so you can imagine that the graffiti writers, when they heard that that there was this potential plan to make this a public space, were concerned. Graffiti is a sensitive ecosystem that thrives on anonymity. Many people have been criminalized for their use of the site and the value they've imbued in this place, the beauty. And people have government names and monikers, and so we pitched as a process that we wouldn't do the kind of spectacle of community engagement. We would have that public engagement, but parallel to that, we would also engage graffiti writers. And so that ended up looking like us meeting in a range of different environments, bars, and this is one of the bars that we had a meeting at. We, got anonymous emails. We had representatives sent to us. We got, it was really about gaining trust and having conversations in this sort of network of people. One of the things that we communicated early with the graffiti writers was that, because their initial take on this was, can you do nothing? Can you just leave it? It's fine. It's just fine the way it is. And what we shared with them is that the site, if you do nothing, the site will be inundated on a daily basis just from high tides in 30 years. Moreover, in addition to the pressures coming from the water side, on the land side, development pressure is encroaching, and in fact, construction is set to happen it's already started now on condos and adjacent to the site, and that's only continuing to intensify. So this, doing something is actually the chance to save graffiti piers. So we started to reframe the project as a Save Graffiti Pier project, that in order to keep it the same, we have to do something. So we asked, among these disparate conversations that we were having, we asked everyone the same question: what is the best thing that can happen here, and what is the worst thing that can happen here? Something's going to happen. What's the best and what's the worst? And so we charted all the responses, and the majority of them fell on the side of the spectrum of untouched, and the worst kind of fell on this idea of a new park. And so we found in this mapping kind of a few emerging themes that we said would guide us towards a design. And so that is the ensuring of continuation and ensuring the continuation and expansion of art, keeping the site vegetated and passive, making it safe and accessible without looking safe and accessible, and keeping it gritty. And so we were able to go back to the graffiti writers and share how each of the four shaped this ultimate landscape design. For instance, keeping it gritty, when we asked the graffiti writers, what does gritty mean? They were like, rocks, mud, water, plants. And so we found this kind of intersection between the ecosystem of graffiti and that of this intertidal what was an intertidal landscape. And so that this keeping it gritty idea actually influenced our proposal to remove the bulkheads and reintroduce this intertidal landscape. And so being able to communicate then how those conversations that we were having, again, influenced the landscape design, and that kind of back and forth was really important part of our process. For instance, at one of those points, we took renderings and met up at a bar and had graffiti writers tag their feedback onto the early renderings. And so we went through this process of decoding that feedback and going back to the design and reworking. So for instance, this is an integration of bioretention with the art walls and vegetation, actually incorporating new surfaces for art making. And this is a green frame where we're actually visually buffering on Pier 18, visually buffering from adjacent new construction, but in the kind of traces of where pioneering species are now. And so this approach also influenced our approach to site furnishing. Looking for ways to design furnishings that integrate with the material history of this place and could provide additional services for graffiti that's inclusive of, like, we did this research on the archival drawings of this structure, and we found these railings to be so beautiful. And so we integrated that into our design of new railings. And so at another point, we came back to the artists after COVID hit. And so we, culling from the tradition of zines, that's so much a part of street art. We made a zine with the graffiti writers, and they submitted their artwork. They were going out to the pier, making art, taking pictures, sending them to us. And we then were kind of in the zine, mixing the art with the landscape design updates. Much like the site is entangled between the two itself, the zine became a jumbling of those in a way that allowed us to dialogue in the way that this community already dialogues. So I'll take you through a series of before and after images. This is before, this is after. So you see our introduction of railings that speak to that, the 1923 original railings, bringing it up to code, and reinforcing a green buffer. So this is before, and this is after upgraded surfacing, making it ADA accessible, and incorporation of a bioretention here. This is before, and this is after. So the idea here is to, creating planting beds out of places where there already exists vegetation, but introducing a more robust and sustainable planting palette. This is before, this is the south end of, and the shady side, the east side of the structure of Pier 18. This is after, so we're introducing a shade garden and some of the furnishings as well. This is before, this is after, really, again, just reworking the planting so that it's more robust and resilient, and introducing shade trees here and furnishings. This is before, this is atop the southern trellis where people are already climbing up to get here and look out at the views. So we proposed an ADA ramp cut through this structure. Again, the railings, and they said, whatever you do up there, don't make it the High Line. And so we, in terms of planting, we're talking about sedums, grasses, and gravel, and just really keeping it simple and trying to keep it in the spirit of what it is today. And then on Pier 20, a pier that currently is falling into the river, we're talking about shoring it up structurally, but also with new seawalls, but also using the places where it is allowing for water to enter into the pier structure, introduce kind of intertidal marsh planting, and integrate these new seawalls in such a way that allows artists to dialogue with the rising tides. So this is an image of the marsh planting, the new seawalls, and ways in which people can also occupy this space that they currently don't occupy, and integrating this reintroduced intertidal landscape. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm looking forward to being in dialogue with you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lori Brown. I would like to thank the Architectural League of New York and the jury for selection in this year's Emerging Voices program. I'm immensely honored to be included in this group. I would also like to thank Ann Reiselbach and Katarina Flaxman in working with me through the preparation for related programming and publicity materials. I speak with you today from Syracuse, New York, which is the traditional territory of the Six Nations Haudenosaunee people. Syracuse and its surrounding area is home to 4 federally recognized nations, the Oneida, Onondaga, Mohawk, and Seneca, and 2 unrecognized territories of the Cayuga and Tuscarora. Without them, we would not have access to this gathering and to this conversation. We take this opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land and to recognize their continued stewardship in this region. I seek to broaden discourse around the discipline of architecture by enhancing societal awareness of the too often untapped potential of architects' practice and expanding for whom architecture serves, while raising awareness of women's contributions to the built environment. My research, teaching, and engagement create bridges between architecture, a field historically and woefully underrepresented by women and people of color, and the public. Over the past almost 2 decades, I've been on the quest to transform architecture into a more diverse discipline, reflective and responsive to contemporary social, political, and environmental conditions, to situate how gender contributes to and expands who can become an architect, and how architecture can more significantly contribute to our world by engaging the politics of space. My work can be traced to the intersections of my experiences as a woman in a still male-dominated discipline, and my desire for architecture to contribute more significantly to improving the built environment for a broader public. I have focused on expanding the role of architecture into reproductive health care, women's shelters, birthing centers, immigration shelters, areas often overlooked or ignored by the discipline. Architects must reach out more broadly to work with those for whom architecture has not been readily accessible. I work assiduously to follow this guiding principle as an architect, as a scholar, as an activist, and an educator. I work to make change through a variety of ways and scales of endeavors. I research and write. I design with ignored segments of the population, including abortion clinics, women's shelters, birthing and humanitarian centers at US borders. I use my architectural expertise to engage legislative entities who have used building codes for political means. I co-founded and lead Architects, an organization that promotes all women-identified individuals to foster more diversity and inclusion within the academy and practice and take action out in the world, engaging highly politicized topics. I question the architectural canon and am creating a diverse body of architectural knowledge more reflective of our society, and through these collaborative efforts, building a transnational feminist coalition to create global change. I operate at the intersection of theory and practice, which informs my feminist methodologies. I seek to create change and action out in the world. I continue to return to philosopher Elizabeth Gross' question, how to think architecture differently, how to think in architecture or of architecture without conforming to the standard assumptions. As Gross writes, insofar as architecture is seeking not so much innovation, not simply the latest fad, but to produce differently, to engender the new, to risk creating otherwise, how do we keep architecture open to its outside and force it to think? Can architecture become something, many things, other than what it is and how it presently functions? I discover ways to bring my architectural expertise into a range of arenas where we historically have not been present. The work I will discuss illustrates how research is the instigator for so many avenues of engagement, collaboration, and activism I have taken. I will focus on two larger research interests, the first being gender and diversifying the discipline, and the second, the politics of space. During my third year as an assistant professor at Syracuse University, two female sophomore students approached me regarding their frustrations with their architectural education because it included so few women and people of color. These conversations led to their co-founding Women in Design, a student organization at Syracuse University, where I served as faculty advisor. Little did they realize that our conversations would change the trajectory of my life. In my role as an architecture professor, I was compelled to take action. For change to occur, more women must be recognized for our contributions to the discipline. One of my initial efforts was to curate an exhibition, Feminist Practices, highlighting the next generation of women whose practices engage feminist methodologies. Traveling to architecture schools around the United States and Australia, the exhibition culminated in my first book, Feminist Practices, Interdisciplinary Approaches to Women in Architecture. These were the beginnings of what would become my longstanding commitment for change. I did not want my students to continue to experience what I too had experienced throughout my education and career. As a direct result of this publication, I co-founded Architects, a New York-based organization for women in architecture. We seek to transform the profession by bridging the academy and practice. Architects offers both educational and action-oriented programming. Our initiatives create exposure, mentoring, and public engagement for all women-identified architects in the New York City region and for students in architecture programs across New York State. A few examples include our global efforts to write more women into Wikipedia and to work with students and faculty in architecture and design programs across New York State to bring more women in to discuss their design work. Working with co-curators Sara Ravison, Andrea Merritt, and Roberta Washington, our most recent project is Now What? Advocacy, Activism, and Alliances in American Architecture since 1968. This is an interactive exhibition and online catalog with eventual publication that tells the largely unknown history of architects and designers who have intersected with political movements and advanced issues of equity and social justice, specifically those of the civil rights, feminist, LGBTQ, and environmental movements of the last half century. Every exhibition venue documents and displays the powerful intersection of national and grassroots efforts of architects and designers to renew architecture as an expression of equality, refusing to separate how we live from where we live. We were inspired by Susanna Torre's Women in American Architecture, a historic and contemporary perspective, a groundbreaking exhibition organized with the Architectural League that began at the Brooklyn Museum in 1977, which was directly responsible for an increase in scholarship and public awareness of the overlooked role of women in the profession. A critical theoretical difference between our project and the 1970s is that we expand the scope of who and what is included. Feminism has had a tremendous influence on social movements, and we demonstrate these connections between 1968 to today, moving beyond the 1970s second wave white middle class feminism through engaging an intersectional framework. The American legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw argues that the failure of feminism to interrogate race means the resistance strategies of feminism will often replicate and reinforce the subordination of people of color. And the failure of anti-racism to interrogate patriarchy means anti-racism will frequently reproduce the subordination of women. Feminism is multiple and complex and engages with broader issues of race, class, and gender, including areas such as the environment, queer and gender identities, and poverty, to name but a few. Each chronological board is color-coded by theme, and key historical moments are included, locating events in our discipline within the broader political, social, cultural, and economic context. We ask for local histories to be literally written in so that the project is a continual archive in the making. Advocacy through design examines how architects have merged their advocacy with their design work. The role of representation of public programming has participated in presenting formats for critical thought and mobilization. The efforts made by the Architectural Academy to attract students from diverse backgrounds and to expand research and teaching to include histories of underrepresented groups, and how workplace organizations have fought against employment and workplace discrimination and expanded definitions of practice. The exhibition is continuing to travel and will be at the Boston Society of Architects in the near future. The impetus of the research focusing on the politics of space was my frustration by the lack of political engagement with our discipline, and so I was compelled to investigate topics that were and remain unavoidably political. In my second book, I examined the spaces of abortion clinics, women's shelters, and hospitals, with the primary focus on the landscapes of reproductive healthcare access in North America. It sought to explore spaces that have often been ignored or even perceived as irrelevant to the discipline, ones that are solely used by women. This is important because, as philosopher Sandra Harding writes, this sort of research generated from the experiences of women are critical for the larger concerns of social life in general. For women should have an equal say in the design and administration of the institutions where knowledge is produced and distributed for reasons of social justice. The research seeks to make explicit political, cultural, and social influences. Where or can spatial agency be located, and how can our architectural thinking bring new insight into these subjects? To help you imagine how such spaces exist in various parts of the country, I will begin with a short film clip from 2012 outside of a clinic in Louisville, Kentucky.
Basically, over 90% of women that exterminate their children are doing it out of convenience. Please today repair and turn to Christ. It's so important. Again, as I said, we're not getting all these programs. We clarify again, mothers. Yeah, come out with woodwork.
As this clip exemplifies, these issues are one of geography, of physical access. No matter how many state laws are passed or how many Supreme Court decisions are made, the legal question is one exercised within our built environment. This legal underpinning is the First Amendment and the guarantee to the right of free speech and peaceful assembly, and how these rights intersect with a woman's federally guaranteed right to access abortion. Because protest has for decades been such an integral part of the abortion debate, the way we understand and use public space is critical to rethinking access to reproductive health care. Although legal on paper, abortion is becoming more and more difficult to access for poor women of color. Political theorist Iris Marion Young discusses how civic action and even disobedience are critical to a thriving democracy. For Young, this primary connection is the public sphere. A healthy public sphere, as she writes, is a space of opposition and accountability and policy influence. Political actors, through their various methods, can help instigate change. Their power resides in the ability to uncover, expose, publicize, and even shame powerful actors. In so doing, ordinary citizens' use of the public sphere is one way to limit power and hold powerful actors accountable. But what happens when one set of actors are so successful in curtailing women's legal rights to autonomy and control over their own body? One of the initial issues that drew me to this research was this intersection of a highly politicized and charged space being contested in the public realm. As polarizing an issue as abortion is in various parts of North America, it provides a platform to think through complex relationships of space, a woman's body, varying degrees of federal and state control, the fluid and ever-shifting terrain of reproductive healthcare access, the potentials of design thinking and transforming spatial relationships, and ways to radically rethink and find agency within them. It was critical to include the many stakeholders who are a part of creating and maintaining reproductive healthcare access across North America, as well as ways to more broadly define possibilities of access to care. The research includes analytical mapping and spatialization methods, interviews with clinic providers, owners, healthcare employees, and escorts, to data collection of access to emergency contraception in the most restrictive states at the time of publication. Legal frameworks and Supreme Court decisions play a significant role in defining physical relationships around reproductive healthcare facilities as they create precedent of literal dimensions around buildings and bodies. I will provide one example: Hill versus Colorado. Reacting to aggressive and confrontational tactics by anti-abortion protesters that had often impeded access, the Boulder City Council passed the first bubble law in 1986. Originally referred to as a buffer zone ordinance, this ordinance protected those entering abortion clinics and doctors' offices from severe harassment from anti-abortion protesters. The ordinance stipulated within 100 feet from a clinic or office, a demonstrator could not approach someone closer than 8 feet without explicit permission, creating a bubble of protection around someone entering or exiting the building. The Colorado legislature acknowledged that the exercise of a person's right to protest or counsel against certain medical procedures must be balanced against another person's right to obtain medical counseling and treatment in an unobstructed manner. The Supreme Court upheld the 1993 Colorado measure in 2000. Mississippi was one of the states I examined further due to its highly conservative state government, its reproductive healthcare policies, and the state education requirements towards public school sex education. At the time of the book's publication, Mississippi rated as the most conservative state in the country, according to Gallup Politics. The state had the second highest rated teen pregnancy birth rate and gonorrhea infection rate in the United States, and Mississippi's sex education law mandated either abstinence plus or abstinence only, meaning parents must opt in for their child to receive sex education classes. The state of Mississippi has and continues to enact state restrictions known as trap laws against abortion providers. These are targeted, and the state subjects providers to burdensome restrictions not applied to other medical professions. A patient must receive state-directed counseling that includes information designed to discourage the patient from having an abortion, and then wait 24 hours before the procedure is provided. Counseling must be provided in person and must take place before the waiting period begins, thereby necessitating 2 trips to the facility. The state has a physicians-only restriction and prohibits certain qualified healthcare professionals from performing abortions. The use of telemedicine to administer medication abortion is prohibited. And another example is that the state requires abortion clinics to meet unnecessary and burdensome standards relating to their physical plant, equipment, and staffing. The state has high rates of poverty for both individuals and female head of households with children under 5 years of age. The national rate for an individual below the poverty level at the time of publication was 9.8%. For Jackson, that individual rate was 23.5%, and for female heads of household with children under 5, it was 53.5%. If other spaces of access are considered and hospitals are included, the state's geography of access exponentially expands, with 112 hospitals around the state. If we imagine ways to reduce the need for abortion altogether through reliable access to emergency contraception, again, the state's point of access radically increases. Research assistants and I called all the pharmacies in Mississippi, as well as South Dakota, North Dakota, Kentucky, Nebraska, and Utah to determine if they stocked and sold emergency contraception. We posed as women in need of filling a prescription, which was required at the time. Now this is an accessible over-the-counter medication. We documented the responses of all pharmacists we were able to speak with. There are or were 462 pharmacies across the state, and we've discovered that 66% of male pharmacists would not carry emergency contraception, and 55% of female pharmacists would not carry emergency contraception. We were told that no one working on that staff that day would sell it to us, that they stock it and they won't dispense it, or that you need a prescription. We can't find a non-prescription kind. Well, at that time, there was no such thing as a non-prescription kind. I've presented this research and subsequent projects since the book's original publication, and through these various audiences and networks, I was introduced to the owner and doctor of the Alabama Women's Health Center in Huntsville. They asked me to work with them to design a public interface for their clinic. This project is an opportunity for design praxis. Due to the concern of their clinic possibly needing to meet ambulatory surgical facility building codes in Alabama, Alabama Women's Health Center bought this existing medical facility because it was already ambulatory code compliant. The site they purchased consists of 2 parcels and provides a physical buffer to their immediate context and the ability to expand in the future if needed. After interviews with the clinic owner, doctor, employees, and clinic escorts, the design considerations were quite clear. The owner wanted to ensure that what they build will contribute to the neighborhood. Across the street was a recently built new high school, and he hopes to complement and work within this context. Patients' protection and their privacy from the public are of utmost priority. A new secure entrance/exit to the site is proposed. The fence will incorporate a robust surveillance system. The parking will be expanded and repaved. An outdoor shaded seating space will be created for those who accompany patients as well as employees and the escorts. A more resilient landscape will be added. A play space for patients' children so they no longer have to wait in their cars for 4 to 5 hours at a time. And probably the best request after the play area is the desire to incorporate a water feature to both water the grass and those who just may or may not be adjacent to the wall by the sidewalk. The wall has different material resolutions as it makes its way around the property. When adjacent to protesters, its public face is solid with an embedded sprinkler system that can be activated at a moment's notice, yet its interior private face reveals the water systems as an almost sculptural form with plants to eventually grow in and create a lush vertical landscape. When the fence is at the very back next to the single-family residential neighborhood, it becomes a shorter and more open wooden frame system. Here is a view of from the sidewalk looking towards the entrance, and a view under the shaded space with a water area for play at the back. In Feminists Without Borders, Decolonizing Theory, Practicing Solidarity, Chandra Talbot Mahanti writes, feminist practice operates at a number of levels, at the level of daily life through the everyday acts that constitute our identities and relational communities, at the level of collective action groups, networks, and movements constituted around feminist visions of social transformation, and at the levels of theory, pedagogy, and textual creativity, and I will add design, and the scholarly and writing practices of feminists engaged in the production of knowledge. I aspire to create a world that is more just and equitable, one where our discipline rises to the needs of societies and the environment's most pressing challenges, and one where the knowledge producers actually represent the diverse and intersectional identities of our world. Thank you so much for listening.
So thank you so much to both Lori and Sarah for those presentations. It's just, it's really nice to, I know it's recorded, but like, it's really nice to hear you both talk in detail about the projects that you've done. For me, what's really special about having you present, although recorded, is to hear about how you think about these projects and to learn more about your processes. And what really comes through in listening to both of you are your values and how your individual practices exercise those values through design and the other activities that you do. I think design is a kind of very big word here. Laura, you mentioned the word praxis at the end of your presentation. So I wanted to start with a question for both of you, and then maybe follow up with a question for each of you individually, and then open, and then to see what comments and questions we have from the audience. Your practices are very distinct and unique, but if I could, I would say that there are a few themes that run kind of collectively through both of them. In particular, issues of belonging, erasure, justice, the everyday. And one that comes through really strong for me, because I'm also interested in this, is the importance of personal experience as a kind of source and as a guide. And Sarah, you mentioned watching the storm, watching Katrina unfold. Lori, you talk about being a woman in architecture and your identification with underrepresented peoples, right? And how these experiences guide your kind of orientation and your direction for the change that you want to make in the world and the kind of creative work that you want to do in the world. And so I was thinking, I was wondering if you could speak to personal experience and how that plays a role in your process, how you see that fitting into how we as designers operate, and also in both your cases, because you're both educators as well, how that plays into your teaching.
I can start. Thank you so much. And it's great to be in conversation with you, Sarah, and to hear about your work from you. And it's so nice to see you too, Rosalind. I think my voice and my experience is critical because it already brings things to the table that help inform just my own positionality and in my relationship with others. And I think about that a lot, not only in the kind of research I do and who I'm engaging and the questions I ask and trying to provide a space for those to speak to me. So it's a real collaboration. But I think for my students, it's so important that their experiences are contributing to their education and to their identity of what design can mean because of their very disparate backgrounds. And so I really, really ask them to make central their experiences and their interpretations as a way to move through the world as a designer and the way to think and the way to see, because it only enriches what is possible if your experiences and then in conversation and collaboration with others become a mechanism to have other experiences as a part of a design process, and ultimately then what that results in. And I think looking back, I wasn't necessarily taught that way, but somehow through my own environment, I think similarly, I'm from the South, and the South has played a huge role in my own identity. And kind of understanding that through, a lot of years of just looking back and therapy, you start to, I realized that identity and place is so interconnected. And rather than try and downplay that, I actually now really try to upplay it, because I think for so long, I was a little bit embarrassed about being from the South. And I realized, once I became okay with that, especially when I went to grad school in the Northeast, that, there's a lot to celebrate from where you are from. And that I find that only contributes to my understanding and my ability to make and engage with others.
Lori, I guess that's why they put us together. This must be like Southern Night. Southerner Night. It was a privilege to learn about your work, Lori. And with regards to this question, I mean, my first real engagement with architecture planning was after Katrina, and was attending community meetings as a layperson, and tracking the conversations, and witnessing what was being constructed based on input from people, and realizing after it got built, or being frustrated with things after they got built, feeling like, what that's not, I realized I didn't understand the drawings that people were presenting. I didn't understand the translation process. I felt like the architects that were coming to New Orleans were, well-meaning, but that there were limitations in their tool set, in their skill set rather, for translating. There were a million meetings. There was no shortage of meetings, but it was a shortage of an ability to translate and interpret that input. And so you can probably see that in my work and in the work of our office, a commitment to the process of interpretation and continuing the conversation with our stakeholders, with our client, and this works even, this kind of method is useful even when working with, a private client, a residential project, or an institution. And so this idea of translation is this really, has probably generated a really sincere belief on my part that we can design, everything we design should be specifically crafted to a place. And growing up in a place like Louisiana that feels so specific, I really do feel like there is a craft. We use the word craft a lot, that we have to craft places responsive to very specific ecologies, people, contexts, materials, spatial and cultural rhythms, and that, so I really try hard not to have a kind of a signature to our design work, but that they really are innovated in every context, and specifically, sort of bespoke for every context that we're working in.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I think maybe I can segue into the question for you, Sara, is to hear you talk a bit more about the relationship between memory and landscape in your work, because what I hear when you're talking is this kind of like making yourself hypersensitive in the kind of observation and the listening, and that the living thing that you're making isn't the outcome of a design, but starts in the process of working with the community. And that is really apparent when you talk about the project at Mander. And then you talk about the kind of a monument that breathes, or you bring that to us. And then that moment when you were talking about, this is the stuff of landscape architecture in Houston, curbs, planting, lighting, the elements of a story. And I start to see the environment or the landscape as something that connects us to the story of the land, and both the past, but also in the present. So I think I'm really taken by those ideas that you're there's a kind of perspective and approach that seems that is growing through your practice in your office, and the communication and the kind of ways in which you are cultivating that. And I maybe just hear you talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. In neuroscience, when they, I know you weren't expecting me to say that. So let me make my point quickly. In neuroscience, when if you experience amnesia, you lose your sense of, you lose your memory, and you lose your identity. And so you don't know who you are without your memory, without your, and there's a parallel, with how is it designed. And so my work in memory and emphasis on memory is really as a method of understanding a place. It's, the present is a function of the past. We're living in a continuous past. And so, but in architecture, our understanding of the memorial is a very kind of restricted understanding of time and of the past. And therefore the forms associated with memory really are pretty narrow. You know, memorials are meant to, or traditionally in architecture, are meant to generally speak to a moment in time, a person, a hero, a tragedy, a triumph. But you know, in a lot of places, particularly, sorry, excuse New York City happening outside. People's lives and their realities are a function of history, and that's all the more important in communities where their histories are not very visible in the built environment. And so, you know, Freemanstown may not get a memorial, but they do need to upgrade the stormwater system. And so, whatever public investments being made, if all we have is a 60-foot wide streetscape, then there's an opportunity always to imbue our world with these stories. Everything we're making is telling a story. A question is, what is it telling? What is it not telling? And so that's really our approach. I think there's an opportunity to leverage in everything that we're so powerful as makers of cities and places, and I don't take that lightly.
Thank you for that. Maybe Lori, you mentioned Liz Gross, and I love Liz Gross as well, and how she asks us to think or do architecture differently, and then especially the way that she directs us to find openings, right? To look to the outside. And you mentioned also that you've been doing this work for almost 20 years, right? So I guess my question is, having traveled on this path, which is a path of kind of discovery as well as hard work, the path also changes you as you forge the path, right? So this is also like this idea of becoming. I want to know what openings you see now that maybe you wouldn't have seen at the beginning, and what do you want to do next?
Thank you for the question. You know, I think the openings I see are so in part reflective of our contemporary political, social, and economic condition, which even 2 years ago were quite different. And there's such a need for design, and I say design, and I mean very broadly, like what our skill sets and how we think can make a difference to the built environment. And I'm incredibly hopeful that we can be more significant players in the future of the planet, and I mean that quite literally, given the climate crisis. And I think, you know, even with Biden's most recent announcement of infrastructure and thinking about these openings, like these are places we need to be in. We have to be a part of these conversations. And I think the kind of galvanizing force of civic action is bringing so much to bear. So these openings for me are both kind of design, their policy, they're engaging with the political actors who are making these things possible. I want to be a part of that decision making. I want to help make that happen. So for me, the next things are trying to get more involved at a larger scale to help have our voices, these types of voices present and a part of these decision making spaces. Because that's, to me, I think scaling up our impact is critical for the built environment to actually improve for the kind of constituencies I think that both Sara and I are invested in, which is the general public. Like, I think those spaces, our broader public needs us. We need to be working with them because there's so much to do to improve the space for the lives of our communities. So for me, that's the goal for the next so many years.
Thank you. I thought we could maybe now go, there are a couple of questions in the Q&A area. There's a couple from Arthur Clement, specifically for Sara. I'll just read them both and maybe where is the Houston Freetown Park in relationship to Houston's Freedom Park in the 3rd Ward? Are you aware of how that park was revitalized several years ago? Any thoughts when comparing and contrasting the 2 park sites in 2 different historically Black areas in Houston? So that's one. And then I'm just gonna, he addresses you directly here again. Sara, do you have any thoughts with how New Orleans has evolved as a city since Katrina? What are your thoughts about how certain historical neighborhoods were transformed, like the lower 9th Ward after Katrina?
Freedmanstown is about 2 miles from Emancipation Park. Freedmanstown is in the 4th Ward, Emancipation Park is in the 3rd. The Freedmanstown was kind of the original civic center of Black Houston, and when the 4th Ward declined, 3rd Ward became that. So yeah, they're about 2 miles from each other. I mean, they're very different. The Genesee Street project, it's a 60-foot wide road, right of way, 1 block long. And Emancipation Park is, I mean, a 10-acre park, I think. So they're very different in typology. And Emancipation Park, you know, they went the route of really investing in the building. And so the landscape, I think, it just has it. It's hard to really, it's apples and oranges in a lot of ways. And then the second question was New Orleans. What do I think about how it's been rebuilt? I think there are some, I think the most interesting things are yet to happen, which is, I didn't think it would take this long, but some of the most interesting, compelling ideas that were generated right after the storm are still working their way through political advocacy. And so I think the most exciting things actually in post-Katrina are yet to happen. I mean, we're still living in a post-Katrina world. And so some of the most progressive ideas about public transportation and about housing are really, I mean, keep your eyes still on New Orleans. I think it's yet to come, some landscapes, some just rethinking and going back to some of the things that worked in terms of urban form in the bones of the city. So, and some of the things that didn't work, new approaches to ecology and living with water. So there's some great people there, and I'm excited about what's possible still. Did I hit all the questions? I think so.
So yeah. There's a question from Paul Lewis for both of you. He writes, you have both pursued and produced distinctive and unique bodies of work within the design disciplines, implicitly and explicitly critiquing assumed and dominant models of working. Are you more or are you less optimistic about the future of the discipline relative to 5 years ago, and why?
I mean, for 5 years ago, so that's what, 16? I think the biggest change that I've seen has happened in the last year, at least in terms of conversations that are being had. I don't know that that's necessarily materialized into different ways of teaching or practicing per se, but I do think that as the climate crisis clarifies, as political and social tensions clarify in terms of a national discourse, as all of these kind of pattern breaks start to coincide with one another, there are pressures on our discipline to expand our methods of working. And so I do feel like there's an earnest investment being made, but I think we're not going far enough in terms of thinking of particularly academia, but also practice as a laboratory for what's possible. I think it's just, we're like very much, we very much teach and practice relative to precedent. And I think that holds us back from really, we're inventors, we should be. It's just wide open. And as soon as we're the more that we just anchor what we do to precedent, the less we are able to really step up to the plate in a way that the world, honestly, frankly, needs us to. I think that designers have a significant role to play in some of the biggest challenges facing us, and we're starting to talk about it, but in terms of what we do, how we do it, advocating on behalf of our role in shaping cities and places and landscapes, I think we have to dream bigger and do bigger.
I'm in total agreement. And the part I would want to add to is I am optimistic, but I think our architectural models, which is in some ways what Sarah's referring to, how we educate has to radically change. And I think unless that happens, we're only going to continue to produce the status quo as the next generation of graduates goes out into the workforce. But I also am quite hopeful because these students are so inspiring and pushing and forcing change. They're not accepting no. So I think in many ways, they're the hope that gives me, the courage to keep pushing, because they want different things. And if they want it, it's going to push through and move into the discipline as well. So I think it has to come from both sides, but I think our architectural educational models have to radically change, both in terms of social, political, equity, content, and combined with the climate crisis. Like, we can't continue to build the way we do. It's not sustainable. So we all have to become better educated in these arenas too. So I think there's a lot of work to do for all of us in order for that hope to manifest in real change out in the built environment. But yes, I'm the half full type. So I have to remain hopeful. Yeah.
I mean, I totally agree with both of you. It's so hard to see what it needs to be when we can identify that it's something that we haven't yet seen, and so precedent becomes a kind of thing that we can fall upon, or that's how I see it. It's a kind of weak position. There are other problems with it that are not just stated so anodyne in such an anodyne way, but I wonder what some of those, if there were a way to envision what that might look like, if we have any clues about what that might look like. I mean, maybe what you're saying, Lori, about people coming up, younger people coming up, experiencing the world in different ways, seeing the world in different ways. One of the things that we can do as educators is to hear them and to listen to them and to take seriously the questions that they raise. And that has to do with a kind of flattening that happens in education, perhaps, right? Mm-hmm. So flattening and kind of porosity maybe of the institution within a greater context of the world.
Yeah. I mean, I'm director of diversity, equity, inclusion in my school, and have been reaching out to others and been doing reading about institutions. And, institutions don't really want to change. They don't want to readily change. And I think it speaks also to our social political conditions. Like, what causes change is critical mass pushing back and forcing conversations and forcing policies to be different. So what we have ahead of us is a huge endeavor. But I think with the kind of critical mass that has emerged since last summer, I think I'm hopeful it's possible.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, maybe we could end there. I wanted to just bring up a quote that one of my students brought to class the other day. I think it was Adrienne Marie Brown, who said, the crisis, I'm going to paraphrase, but the crisis produces the situation that we're in, but the way in which we work on it is kind of long and slow and meticulous work. So I really appreciate the work that both of you are doing, and thank you for today.
Thank you very much.
And I'd like to thank all of you. It's been a tremendous series. As I said, it's still going on because, as you are both painfully aware, you still have interviews to take part in that will be published on the League's website. You can also go back and look at earlier presentations, such as the one by Rosalind and her partner, Troy. So please stay tuned. The League is moving on to other programs. Next week, we have FF Distance Edition visit to Studio Gang. And we have another episode of American Roundtable too. So I'm looking forward to that and to hearing more from all of you. And thank you. It's been terrific.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.